White racist woman is rushed to the hospital, where a doctor saves her life. When she wakes up, she is furious to see. A black man stood over her. The emergency room was busy with nurses making choices about life and death. Monitors beeped in time with the controlled chaos as things moved quickly. Dr. Elijah Matthews stepped into the cook his. Before a nurse came in, he or she looked around the room with the calm precision of someone who had seen it all. "Hold on tight, doctor." "Matthews, we have a problem. Bethany Wallace, 56, important condition. She's in surgery right now, but there were problems." Elijah nodded, already focused, and he suited up right away. Got up and went to the operating room. As he did so, the seriousness of the situation hit Miss Wallace. Brought in after passing out at her house. It was supposed to be a normal surgery, but it wasn't. Now it was his job to save what he could. Could the surgery go on for hours? Elijah's hands were steady and precise, and he shut out the noise and other things that were going on around him. He was so tired that he didn't even notice the small tremors that started to show up when he was done. Put on his gloves and looked at the time. Hours had passed, but Miss Wallace was still stable. He had done his job and she was still alive, then living, and she would fully recover. He didn't leave the operating room for praise or thanks, but for the next. That was the case, but soon after his pager went off, it was Miss Wallace's alarm going off. In the recovery room, Miss Wallace's face hurt, and her eyes got narrow when Elijah looked at her. Swept over him, her eyes hardening as they hit his face. "You," she spat. Voice sharp. "I want to talk to the real doctor, not you." Elijah was ready for this. He had years of medical and personal experience that had prepped him for times like this. Racism wasn't new. It just came up. Different bags. He stood at the foot of her bed, as calm as ever. "I did your surgery, Miss Wallace," he said. Tone neutral. "Your situation was very bad, but you made it through and you're on your way to getting better." Miss Wallace's lips. "I pulled through," she said with a sneer. "You call this pulling through?" She pointed to the bandages on her stomach and face. He knew exactly what she meant when she said, "I've never felt worse in my life." "What did you do to me?" Well, Elijah looked at the chart and saw that her vital signs were normal. He told her that the surgery went well. His voice said, "Even your recovery will take time, but you're getting better. I'll check on you again in a few hours." She snapped, "Check on me," and said, "I want someone who knows what they're doing. I'm not a charity case." Elijah stayed behind. He was shocked for a moment and felt the room shrink under the weight of her words. He had seen this kind of anger before. They only cared about what looked good on the outside, not what was true or facts. Miss Wallace didn't see him as it was enough for her to see that he was black doctor to blame him. "I promise you, Miss Wallace," he said quietly. "Getting the best care possible, but if you want a second opinion, I can set it up." She huffed and turned her face away. "Get me someone else," she said in a low voice. "I want to talk to the hospital director. Someone who knows what." "They're doing." Elijah nodded once, but it was hard to read his face. "I'll tell the director about your request," he said, and then he left the room. Without saying a word, Elijah felt the familiar pang of anger settle into his chest. In the hall, his steps slowed as he kept thinking about the exchange. It wasn't the first time he'd met a case like Miss Wallace, and it didn't matter that he saved her life. She would only ever see his skin. He had learned to deal with it through school and life, but that didn't stop the sting from being sharp back in the staff room. Taking off his surgery cap, he leaned against the counter and closed his eyes for a moment of peace. The noise of the hospital hummed around him, making him feel safe and at ease. Dr. Matthews, a nurse, broke his silence. "Wallace still wants you." Elijah sighed and opened his eyes. "She wants the director," he said, already knowing how to say it. The nurse wasn't sure what to do, and I heard her yelling something about getting you fired if I did. Elijah shook his head. "Hey, don't worry about it. The director will take care of it. I'll check on my other patients in the recovery room, miss." Wallace spat under her breath in her bed. She didn't care that the guy had saved her life. All she could think about was, from the way he looked, she thought a doctor like him didn't belong in this place. She planned to fire him. People like her couldn't trust someone like him. But as she lay there angry, she didn't say anything. Understand that her recovery was going faster than expected, Ed, even though she kept complaining about how bad things were. Thanks to the man she hated, faster than planned, but Miss Wallace didn't see that. All she saw was a target. Later that day, Miss Wallace was moved to a private room. As she settled in, her complaints could be heard in the halls. The hospital bed was clean, and the nurses were kind and helpful, but she lost her anger over small things. Pressed the call button over and over, demanding instant attention, and was never satisfied with the answers given. The clean white beds and soft hum of machines next to her did nothing to make her feel better, Elijah. The next morning, he went into her room with a chart in hand, ready for the expected argument that was about to happen. He had checked her vital signs earlier, and found that everything was going as it should. He knew she would still find algo to hold on to. When he walked in, Miss Wallace was already frowning. Her arms were crossed, and her face was pale but not showing any signs of distress. Her body was getting better, but her scowl stayed hard and fixed that you could feel the tension in the room. "Good morning, Miss W. I'm here to check on your progress," Elijah said in a calm voice. "Didn't I make it clear I don't want you touching me?" she asked with a sneer. Elijah walked up to her. "I'm your doctor, Miss Wallace, and I'll be at your bedside with the same steady efficiency he always had. I did your surgery, and I'm here to make sure you heal properly." "Your vital signs look good," she sneered. "Oh, I bet. It's likely that you messed me up so badly that not even robots can figure it out. I can feel it. It hurts." He knew this was going to end badly ever since you worked on him. She wanted him to make a mistake and say something. That would give her the upper hand, but Elijah had done everything the right way, and Miss Wallace was in a lot better shape than she would have admitted. "I know that healing can be painful, but the pain you're going to, how you're feeling is normal after surgery. If I need to, I can change your medicine, but you look like you're healing well." She laughed and threw the covers off her legs in a dramatic way. "You think I don't know my own body? I've never felt like this. Before it was you, it was what you did to me." Elijah stayed calm. "If you're hurt, I can help, but take it easy. Sure that your surgery went well and that you're in good hands." Her voice was rising, and I don't believe what she was saying. For a second, you might think, "I don't know what this is or what's going on here." She barked at him. She looked at him con disdain and said, "You people simply think you can get away with anything." Elijah's jaw tightened, but he didn't say anything because he had heard this kind of charge before and knew that peer bonding would make her even more angry. Miss Wallace said, "I've seen doctors like you before and I know what kind of care you give. Do you think you can come? Because you don't like the way I look? You're going to do a half job here. I'll have your job for this, promise." Elijah responded in a calm voice. "I'm sorry you feel that way. I promise I've given you the best care possible. Do you not understand? I need to talk to the hospital head. I need someone who knows what they're doing." "Someone like you," she spat. "You've made me worse. And I won't stand for it." Elijah just stood there and watched her, not responding to the insults she threw at him. He just nodded. "Once I get a chance, I'll tell the hospital head about your request," he said quietly. "In the meantime, please let the nurses know if," as he turned to leave, she yelled, "Your pain is getting worse. I'll be back to check on you later." Her voice echoed. "Down the hall, you can bet I'll let them know about this. You won't be working here for much longer." Later, Elijah told Dr. Karen Holloway about what happened in her office. Dr. Holloway sat behind her desk with her face furrowed as she listened. She listened. "She's been this way since she woke up," Elijah said. "I've looked over her case several times, and it looks like everything is going as planned. Her vital signs are fine, and she's getting better, faster than expected. Something is wrong and she blames me, Doctor. C. Holloway, as she rubs her temples. It's not the first time we've dealt with a patient like her. The claims are false, but she will keep making noise if she doesn't stop. It might grow into something bigger. She looked at Elijah and said, "You've done everything." Her eyes became soft with sadness. "Right, Elijah, we both know that. But she's not going to let this go," he said in a low voice, trying not to show his anger. "She wants to talk to you. I told her I'd pass on the word, and I will talk to her." Dr. Holloway agreed, leaning down in his chair. "Chair, but you should know that she's already started making threats. She said she would fire you and I wouldn't be fired." "She might be thinking about a case," Elijah said, but he nodded anyway. The situation was heavy on his mind. "And I've been through this before," he said with a tired tone in his voice. "I just want to make sure the facts are clear," he said. He was told by Dr. Holloway, "I'll take care of the paperwork, but you keep doing what you do best. With Miss Wallace, but don't let her get to you." "I won't," Elijah answered, even though he could feel the pressure. No matter how professional he stayed, Miss Wallace's charges could make waves, even if they were true or not true. Back in Miss Wallace's room, the air was tense because she was fidgeting in her bed all the time. Every groan was emphasized more than it needed to be, as if she were acting for an audience that wasn't there. Every time the door opened, she quickly looked to see if Dr. Matthews was there. The nurses moved around her quietly, knowing better than to hurt her, as she got ready to start another attack. When she yelled, but every time a shadow showed up at the doorway, her lips would curl in anticipation of another one. In conflict, she wasn't done by a long shot. By the third day of Miss Wallace's stay, and the stress she caused by always complaining seemed to hang in the air, affecting everyone. The nurses around her now switched shifts with unwilling sighs when her name came up, and even the hospital staff. Dr. Elijah Matthews, who had seen her room and felt her mood change, stayed focused. He had dealt with cases like before. Miss Wallace was spoiled, angry, and wouldn't take help unless it came from someone who looked like what they thought a doctor should look like. But this time of the morning, it felt like more was at stake. Elijah walked up to her room with a steady resolve, knowing exactly what was in store for him. Elijah went into Miss Wallace's room. Early in the morning, he felt a familiar tightness in his chest as she glared at him from her bed. Her face was red, and she didn't stop to greet him because she was already angry and had a deep frown on her face. "I want to see someone else," she said. "Not you. I've had enough of you," she said as soon as he crossed the doorway. Elijah stood still. He walked up to her bedside with a calm, neutral tone and said, "Miss Wallace, I know you're upset, but I'm here. Check on your progress. Your recovery is going well, and you should be sent home in a few days." Miss Wallace laughed. "You have to be kidding me. I feel worse than when I came in." She let out aloud, "You must be kidding me." With a shaking finger, she told him, "I know it's because of you that you messed me up. My pain's gotten worse." "Better?" Elijah stayed cool while he opened her chart and looked over the most recent test results. Her vital signs are stable, and she is ready for surgery. The pain you're having is normal for people who are recovering from surgery. If you're still in pain, I can make changes to your... "You can't change anything about the medicine," she snapped. Rising, "I don't trust you." "That's not true. How do I know you did the surgery right? People simply think you can get away with anything." It was clear that she was focusing on you people. Elijah paused to let her words sink in. She wasn't just criticizing his skills. She was also criticizing his appearance in her life as a black doctor. He had heard it before, and he knew that getting angry would only give her what she wanted. "I promise you, Miss Wallace, the surgery was done according to standard practice, and you're healing well. Your health is my top concern." "Health?" he said in a calm voice. "You're lying!" she yelled back, her face red with anger. "I know you did something to me. You've been lying the whole time. I'm not going to let you get away with it." Elijah looked her in the eyes and didn't blink. "If you'd like a second opinion, I can get another doctor to look at it, he said. Examine you, but I've done everything I could to make sure you get better, Miss Wallace said with a mean grin. Oh, I see. I'll get a second opinion when I sue this hospital for as much money as it's worth. Elijah didn't answer right away, but her threat hung in the air, and her eyes were filled with power. Had never had before. She found her tool and was now ready to use it. I'll check on you later, he said. Oh, you'll be back all right, she said quietly as she left the room. But it won't be to check on me. You'll have to get your things because you'll no longer have a job, Doctor, Karen Holloway told Elijah as they sat in her office. He thought as he finished telling her about Miss Wallace's latest outburst and her threats of a lawsuit. Now that she has her hands firmly on the table, Dr. Holloway said, tapping her fingers. I talked to the legal about her desk, and while there isn't a real case here, she could cause a lot of problem, even if it's not true. Lawsuits can hurt the hospital's image. Elijah kept quiet while he thought about even though he hadn't done anything wrong, Miss Wallace wasn't interested in the facts or being professional. She found a way to get her way. As a tool, and now she was trying to tear him down with it. I know this is hard for you, Dr. Holloway, she said in a softer voice. We stand behind you. Your work speaks for itself. I like how Elijah answered, keeping his voice calm but firm, but I can't act like it doesn't matter. Me down. It's not just that I might lose my job. It's also how simple it is for someone like her to try to tear me apart. Everything was taken away because of how I look, Doctor. Holloway sighed. I know it's frustrating you. It's not fair, but we'll deal with it. She'll be released soon, and hopefully this is the end of it. Elijah agreed. Even though his chest still hurt, he knew how things could go, even if Miss Wallace didn't have a reel. If she made the claim, it could do some damage, so Elijah stood up and said, I'll keep making my rounds. Let me know if anything changes, Doctor. Holloway saw him leave, and her face tightened with worry. Evening. Elijah went back to Miss Wallace's room and did what he always did. He checked her vital signs and made sure she was okay. She was ready for the flood of complaints this time because she had been healing. As soon as he walked in, she grabbed her. She cried out loud, side to side, her face contorted in fake pain as she did so. He had just hit her and she asked, What did you do to me? Elijah frowned and walked over to look at her cut. It was clean. Miss Wallace kept doing her act while gasping and holding her side as if she was in terrible pain. She yelled, I'm in pain. You did this. You've made me worse. The noise is getting the notice of nurses nearby. Miss Wallace, your wound is healing well. I'll make some changes to your painkillers, but this is a normal part of healing, Elijah told her, declining to interact with her. She yelled, You messed this up. You're trying to get rid of me, aren't you? I'll sue you. I'll sue the nurses looked at each other with unease, but Elijah kept his cool. I'll have someone check on you later, he said. When he turned to leave, Miss Wallace's voice screamed through the hallway. Please rest. You won't get away. With this, Doctor. Matthews, I'll make sure you leave this place of business and never work there again. By the time Elijah got to at his station, he could feel the stress in his shoulders and the tiredness that wasn't from working long hours, but because of how serious the charge was, he could hear Miss Wallace's words in his head, making the same threats over and over. And over Greg Sanders, the hospital's security chief, came up to him with worry written all over his face. I heard she's causing more trouble, Elijah said, feeling his temple. She's not giving up. She's threatening to sue, he said. Now Greg shook his head. He crossed his arms over his chest and said, Don't let her get to you. People who are like her think they can get by in life by being mean. Elijah answered, Doc, you haven't done anything wrong. That didn't help his chest feel better, though. I just want to get through this without things blowing up. Greg tapped him on the shoulder and said, You've got hospital support. We'll deal with it if she does anything. But as Elijah walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from him. Over Miss Wallace wasn't just a patient who was mad. She had a goal, and wouldn't give up until she got what? She wanted 2 more days, and with each sunrise, Miss Wallace's anger grew. Only got worse, she said to almost everyone who would listen. Nurses, hospital staff, other patients. Anyone who walked by, the room had turned into a battleground of accusations and threats, with each contact being draining. Elijah kept his cool as he put on a show of fake pain and anger, but the constant attack from her was wearing him down. He told him that Miss Wallace's day to be released had come, and Elijah looked over her chart one last time to make sure everything was correct order. She was ready to go. Her wound had healed well. Her vital signs were stables. Even though her recovery was slow, it had gone as planned. But the fight wasn't over yet, and Elijah walked into her room. In the morning, Miss Wallace was sitting up in bed with her arms crossed and her face set. She knew this was going to be another fight. She looked like she was ready for another fight when she scowled. She didn't look like a woman about to leave the hospital. Elijah told her gently, "Fight, you're getting out of jail today. Your healing went well, and you're ready to go." Miss Wallace glared at him, her lips curling into a sneer. He raised an eyebrow and said, "You think I'm just going to leave like this? I'm not going anywhere until I get what I want." "Stayed calm, Miss Wallace. You're better now that you've had surgery, and the hospital gave you the care you needed, and now it's time for you to keep getting better at home." She shook her head, her face red with anger. I don't trust any of you. I know you've been trying to get rid of me the whole time, but I'm not going anywhere. That is until I talk to someone who knows what they're doing." Elijah kept his voice calm. "The hospital head is, I know your worries. You've talked to her about them, and she agrees with the treatment plan. You're free to go. I don't care." What she says, Miss Wallace's voice got louder, her anger rising. "You people are all in this together," she said. "Before leaving, I won't go until I'm sure you haven't done anything to me that I don't know about." Elijah took a deep breath and paused. "Taking into account what he said next, Miss Wallace, if you don't leave, we'll have to call hospital security. You've been sent home. Staying here any longer would make it harder for other patients to get care," her eyes flashed. With fury, you wouldn't dare, and Elijah didn't even flinch. "Security will walk you if they have to, but it's your choice for a..." The room was silent for a moment, and Miss Wallace just stared at him. Her chest moved up and down with heavy breaths. She was trying to figure out if she could push this one step further, but Elijah had warned her not to. Miss Wallace suddenly leaned forward and gripped her side in a fake pain. Ow, ow, giving her the chance to leave on her own terms. "You want to throw me? Look at what you did to me. I can't move without feeling like I'm going to fall over. Out like I'm trash." But Elijah didn't answer. Instead, he looked at the nurse standing by the door and said, "Please call." A few minutes later, security guard Greg Sanders showed up at the doorway, his tall body filling the opening. Went right to Miss Wallace, who was still acting like she was in a lot of pain. Greg told Miss Wallace his voice, strong but polite. "You've been released from the hospital. It's time for you to leave." She looked up at him with a shocked look on her face. She said, "I'm not leaving until I know I'm fully recovered. I have the right to be here," which made Greg angry and defiant. Sighed as he walked into the room. "Ma'am, we've done everything that was asked of us, and your doctor has given us the all clear. If you don't leave, we'll have to take you out by hand." Miss Wallace's face hardened. "Go ahead and try it. I'll sue this whole place." Into the ground. "You're not getting rid of me that easily." Greg stayed calm. "That's your choice, but right. We don't want this to get worse, so you need to leave the building now." Miss Wallace sat back in her bed arms. Greg looked at Elijah and said, "I'm not going anywhere," with his arms crossed. Greg pointed to another security officer and gave a small nod. This wasn't going to end quietly without help. Standing outside the door, Miss Wallace's things were quickly gathered and she was put into a A's. Greg pushed her out in her wheelchair. Her angry cries filled the hallway. Wallace kept up her tirade about ties while pointing a shaking finger at Elijah, who was watching from the nurse's station. If you think this is over, I'll be back to let everyone know what you did to me. Harm you. Elijah kept a bland expression on his face, but the weight of what she said made him feel bad in his chest. Even though it wasn't the first time a patient had made threats, Miss Wallace's anger felt more personal. He hadn't done anything wrong, but she was going to tear him down because of who he was as the security team led her out of the hospital. The air in the ward seemed to ease the stress that had been building. Staff that had been there for days started to leave. Nurses looked at each other with relief and relaxed their shoulders as the sound of Miss. Later that day, Wallace's voice finally went away, and Elijah sat in his office and went over. When Dr. Holloway knocked on his door, she walked in with a tired look on her face. I heard what happened. Greg told me everything while I was sitting next to him. Elijah agreed. She wasn't going to leave on her own, Doctor, Holloway said. Sighed and ran her hand through her hair. It's not over yet, she said. I've already heard from our lawyers that Miss Wallace's John said he would come back tomorrow, and Sue, the hospital sheik, wouldn't let this go. Elijah leaned back in his chair. I thought that Dr. Holloway looked at him for a moment before speaking, as if the news were weighing him down. Again, Elijah, you've been more patient than most people would have been. I know this isn't easy, but I'm used to it. Elijah answered, his voice steady but tired. It's just tiring, she agreed. In her eyes she saw understanding. Elijah, the hospital is behind you no matter what she does. Thank you. He spoke softly, but his chest still felt tight. He knew this wasn't the end. Miss Wallace had made that clear. Still, she wasn't done, and tomorrow she would have to fight another battle. As the sun went down, the hospital became silent. Take a moment to sit alone in the staff room and let the peace and quiet ease his nerves. Miss Wallace's weight was heavy on his mind. The steady stream of accusations, threats, and racial undertones in her anger had worn her down. But he did his job and did it well. He knew he had the truth on his side, no matter what Miss Wallace did. That did not make it easier. The next morning, the hospital was surprisingly quiet, but Elijah knew that. The peace was short-lived, because Miss Wallace had said she would come back, and he was sure she would. He got ready for the inevitable clash because he knew this time the stakes were higher and she wasn't just mad anymore. She was out to destroy by mid-morning, when the hospital doors opened and there she was. Miss Wallace marched into the lobby with the resolve of someone who was not going to give up. Her face was still twisted with anger from before. Woman who was sure she had been abused in the worst way possible was surrounded by a younger man. Her lawyer said no. Without a question, she stomped right past the receptionist and into Dr. Holloway's office. Elijah stood back and watched from afar. As the tension in the hallway rose, the receptionist called security with worry, and Greg Sanders showed up minutes later. Moving toward Miss Wallace and her lawyer Elijah stood back and watched, waiting for the right time to speak up. Surely get involved in the fight again. In Dr. Holloway's office, the air was thick with Miss Wallace sat in a chair across from Dr. Holloway's desk, with her lawyer standing next to her and her arms crossed. While talking to them, Dr. Holloway stayed cool, but her face showed that she was angry. Miss Wallace, she said, her voice steady. I know you've come back to talk about your worries, but as I told you before, Doctor, Matthews gave you the best care possible. Your surgery went well, and you were sent home in a stable state, Miss. Wallace cut her off, her words cutting through the air. Best care possible, he almost killed me. I've been in pain since the moment I know it's because of him that she left this place. Her lawyer, a guy in his mid-30s with a deep frown, leaned in to talk to Miss Wallace. We have reason to think that he is suing both Dr. Matthews and this hospital for medical negligence, that Dr. Matthews didn't do his job, which caused her to suffer for a long time, and that Dr. Holloway didn't flinch. I've carefully looked over Dr. Matthews' work, and there's no proof that his treatment was well within. Medical standards were met, and Miss Wallace's healing went as planned. Miss Wallace slammed her hand on the desk. You're all covering for him because you don't want the scandal, which makes me wonder what's going on. Well, I'll make sure everyone knows. Who knows what happened? Elijah stayed outside near the nurse's station and listened to Dr. In Holloway's office. His heart was racing, but his face was calm. He had dealt with this kind of getting into fights before, but the accusations and lack of respect for the truth always made it feel the same. He didn't ask for any of it, but he had to carry it. Finally, after what seemed like forever, the door to Dr. Holloway's office door opened, and Miss Wallace walked out with her lawyer following behind. Her face was red with anger. Dr. Holloway followed them out, taking notes on a pad. Her face stayed the same. Elijah, she said, gesturing for he walked toward them slowly, his face hidden so that they couldn't read it. He could feel Miss Wallace's. As he walked up to Miss Wallace, his eyes were filled with venom. Dr. Holloway said, "This is Dr. Matthews." Elijah turned to Miss and said, "There is no part of the procedure or your recovery that I would be unwilling to explain." Wallace kept his cool. "If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them," he said. "But as I've already said, your return was, as is normal for this kind of surgery. There were no problems, and you were sent home as soon as you were medically ready." Stable Miss Wallace scoffed, and her lawyer stepped in before she could say anything. "We'll be taking this to court," Dr. Matthews said. "I think you should get ready, Elijah. Once this is out in the open, you won't be able to hide behind hospital rules." He kept his cool, even though he could feel the familiar anger rising inside him. "There's nothing to hide," he said. "Stand by the care I gave you. It was in line with the best medical standards." Miss Wallace's face lit up, voice rising. "You'll feel bad about what you did. You simply think you can get away con anything, but not this time." Elijah didn't move his eyes. "I did my job, and I'll keep doing it," he said. The lawyer looked at Dr. Holloway, and the facts will speak for themselves. "We'll get in touch with the hospital's lawyers." Then Miss Wallace and her lawyer turned around and stormed out of the building. The sound of their footsteps could be heard in the quiet. For a short time, the hallway was tense because Dr. Holloway and Elijah Scheck weren't going to talk to each other. She looked at them as they left and said in a soft voice, "Let this go. We'll deal with it. You did everything." "Yes," Elijah agreed, but the tightness in his chest didn't go away. He knew the hospital had his back, but he missed Wallace's threats. Still, her words stuck with him like a wound that wouldn't heal. Later that same day, Elijah found himself sitting alone in his office and looking at the patient files in front of him. He could barely see them because his mind was on other things. Still caught up in the fight, the weight of Miss Wallace's charges against him was bearing down on him. He did everything right, but he knew in cases like this, the truth often took a back seat to how things were seen. He was thinking when the doorbell rang. Greg Sanders walked in with his normal calm face. "Are you okay, Doc?" As the person asked, Elijah leaned against the doorframe and slowly said, "Yeah, I'm fine." Greg gave her a small shrug and said, "I get it. People like her are always looking for someone to blame. They only see what they want to see, no matter what the truth is." Elijah leaned back in his chair and let out a breath. To be over, Greg nodded, knowing that she would finally see that she doesn't have a case. "We'll just have to ride out the storm until then," Elijah said with a small smile. "Thanks, Greg." Greg tipped his head and left, leaving Elijah to think alone once more. The rest of the day went by without a hit, but the Miss Wallace's threat hung over the hospital nurses, who tried not to talk about the fight, but did so anyway. Keep it from Elijah's ears, even though his co-workers and Dr. Holloway were behind him. Elijah could feel the stress. As the day came to a close and the hospital closed, he carried an invisible weight through every pathway. Elijah sat in the break room and looked out the window at the setting sun. The weight of the day was on him, pushed him, but he could take some comfort in the fact that he had done his best no matter what Miss Wallace did. No matter what she said about him, the truth would stand. But as Elijah watched the last light of the day go out, fade into night, He knew the fight wasn't over yet, because he knew Miss Wallace would come after him again. Even though she was angry, she stood tall and ready. It was quiet at the hospital in the morning, but upon the surface, Elijah Matthews knew it was only the calm before the storm. Miss Wallace had been desperate to find ruined his career, and now the case was real. He knew this was going to happen from the start, but hearing the words, even though it was only a few days since he heard from Dr. Holloway, it still felt like a blow he wasn't fully ready for, as Elijah watched as he made his rounds and saw that the nurses, doctors, and even patients seemed to be feeling more tense. It was the weight of the impending fight that his co-workers gave him, making Smile's unspoken support clear, but the responsibility stayed with him. A week went by and the court case began to take shape. The hospital's legal team they are working hard to gather proof to counter Miss Wallace's claims of malpractice and racial prejudice. Even though Elijah knew he hadn't done anything wrong, the thought of the case hurting his image still made him queasy. One morning, Greg Sanders, who was in charge of security, walked up to him near the nurses' station. Greg said in a low voice, "She's back. Miss Wallace, she's here to see you." Even though it wasn't a surprise, the fight he knew was coming felt more real now that Miss Wallace had. He didn't have time to think about why she was back, since the case had already been filed, before Greg added that she wants to talk. Elijah took a deep breath and said, "I'll take care of it." He then walked into the small meeting room where Miss Wallace was sitting. She sat down with her lawyer. Her face was as tough as ever, twisted with the same anger he had seen in her from the beginning, looked at him as if he were the cause of all her pain, and her lawyer sat next to her. His back was straight. The moment Miss Wallace saw Elijah, she spat, "You think you can just walk in here and everything will be fine after? What you did to me?" Elijah could feel her anger in the room, but he wasn't going to let it go this time. He said, "I've given you the best care I could." Elijah said in a calm but strong voice, "I saved your life, and I've taken care of you. With the same level of care I give every patient, all you've done since you woke up is blame me. For one reason, you're telling lies because you can't accept that someone like me helped you." Miss Wallace leaned forward and narrowed her eyes. "Do you think this is about race?" Elijah asked her. "I know it. Is queer you've looked down on me ever since you saw me. Not porque I did anything wrong." Anki, her lawyer, moved uncomfortably because of how I look, but Elijah wasn't done. "I've worked my whole life to be where I am," Elijah kept saying, his voice getting louder but not losing its tone. "People like you have been in my face before, people who only see the color of my skin. But you, Miss Wallace, you've even tried to ruin my job and reputation because you can't accept that I'm the one who did it." Miss Wallace's face turned red with anger, but she didn't say anything. "You want to believe that I treated you," she said. Elijah said in a firm voice, "I treated you badly because that fits your idea of who I am. But the truth is, I treated you the same way. I treat every patient with care and respect. You got better because I did my job. You're still alive because I did my job." The room went quiet as Miss Wallace's lawyer cleared his throat. He could feel the tension between them. Lawyer started to speak, but he was careful. He wouldn't be moving forward with the case, but you should. Elijah cut him off with a look. "Still on Miss Wallace, because the truth will come out in court, and the truth is I did everything I did." Miss Wallace's face stayed cold. "Your claims won't hold up because they're based on hate, not facts," she said. But her lawyer's short nod and eagerness to leave were clear from the way he collected his papers. "We'll see." "See you in court," the lawyer told Miss Wallace as she was led out of the room. She gave Elijah one last mean look. Before they walked out the door, the weeks before the court date were long and hard on the hospital's legal team. Elijah continued, "The team worked hard to get records, talk to witnesses, and get ready for the case the whole time. His job, but the lawsuit never really left his mind. The day of the hearing felt like the end of everything." Elijah sat quietly in court, with Dr. Holloway and the hospital's lawyers on either side of him. Miss Wallace was, as she sat across from him, her face still hardened with anger and determination as her lawyer presented her case. Claims of carelessness, incompetence, and racial bias. But as the hospital's defense team started their argument, Miss Wallace's claims started to fall apart one by one as the hospital's lawyers took them apart. Promises that show proof of Elijah's perfect record, the quality of his care, and the effectiveness of Miss Wallace's surgery. Doctors attested to Elijah's skill, and patient records showed that she had gotten better, went exactly as planned. The courtroom became quieter as Miss Wallace's story became more obvious. The judge moved around in her chair, her confidence waning. She carefully listened to both sides, but the hospital's case stood out. As the case went on, it became clear that Miss Wallace's claims were not true. In the end, the judge handed down that the case was thrown out because Miss Wallace's claims of negligence and racial prejudice were not supported by evidence. Her case was thrown out. Elijah sat still as the words hit him. He felt relieved, but there was also a lingering sadness. He was tired. He knew the truth would win, but the fight had worn him down. Later that night, back at the hospital, Elijah stood in his office and looked out at the city's dimming lights. Dr. Holloway gently knocked on the before going inside. She said softly, "It's over." Her voice filled with quiet pleasure. The judge then threw out the case. "The case is closed," Elijah said. I felt more relieved. I knew we'd win, but I still didn't think we'd do it. "It would be this tiring, Doctor," Holloway told him with a small smile. "You handled this with grace, Elijah, better than anyone else could," he said. "We're proud of you," Elijah answered, his voice quiet but thankful. "I couldn't have done it without you," he said. "With the help of the hospital doctor." Holloway stepped closer. She said, "You deserve to be here, don't you?" "Don't let people like her make you forget that," Elijah said with a small smile. "I won't," he replied. "It's just exhausting, you know. Always having to prove myself, I know, Doctor," Holloway said in a soft voice. "But you've already proven yourself to everyone, Elijah." He was alone in his office when she left. The soft click of the door behind her echoed through the room as night fell. Elijah turned away from the window after taking one last look at the city. The fight was over, and he knew the truth. He had won, but the scars from Miss Wallace's hate showed him how hard it was to be black in America. Doctor in a world that wasn't always fair, but he could breathe a little easier now that the storm was over. Even con todo lo que había sido thrown at him, he had come out stronger. The fight wasn't over yet. Elijah had really hoped that winning the case would make things end and give him a break from all the stress and anger that had been hanging over him for weeks, and in some ways it still did. But as the days went by, he understood that victory wasn't the end, and it wasn't a magic button that turned things back to how they were. After a few days, there were still deep scars that couldn't be seen, that hadn't fully healed. Hearing Elijah was back to his normal life in the hospital. As he went around making rounds, he saw patients and talked to coworkers as usual, but there was an unsaid tension in the air, but clear. One afternoon, while Elijah was at the nurse's station looking over a patient's chart, Greg Sanders came up to him. A serious look on his face, you know. Greg started to lean against the counter. "I've been thinking about how this whole thing could go wrong." Something went down and Elijah looked up, wondering, "What do you mean?" Greg crossed his arms, and his face looked serious but calm. "When Miss Wallace sued you, it wasn't just about the surgery. We both know it was more than that people like her aren't used to having power over them. That's why she tried to hurt you." Elijah agreed, knowing what Greg meant, but the truth still hurt. The man said in a low voice, "I've dealt with it before, but it's tiring. I did everything right, but it still wasn't enough." "Enough?" Greg looked at him with a steady gaze and said, "Enough. You beat her and didn't let her go. Take you down." And that's something Elijah said with a small smile. grateful for Greg's support. I know that, but I guess as much as I thought the case was over, it still makes me feel like I have some things to carry around with me. And Greg gave him an understanding nod. That's normal, fights like that leave scars, but that means something. Elijah sighed as he looked at the chart in his hands. I guess I just don't know how to. The way Greg spoke made me think, maybe it's not about shaking it off. Maybe it's about letting it go, about carrying it with you and letting it make you stronger. Elijah looked at him and thought about what he had said. Slowly. Maybe you're right. Later that night, when Elijah's rounds were over and the hospital was quiet, sat in the break room and stared out at the sky as it got darker. In the distance, city lights flickered. There was the sound of the hospital in the distance. He had always been proud of his ability to keep going, no matter what, the long hours of medical school, the hard days of training, or the quiet, and Elijah had to deal with subtle and not so subtle racism in his work. But he had thought through it all and kept going. He thought that his latest fight with Miss Wallace would be just another problem to solve, but it was more serious than that. As planned, Dr. Karen Holloway walked into the break room while he was lost in thought. When she saw Elijah, she smiled and held out a cup of coffee. Her face was warm, pero she knew what she was asking. Do you mind if I join you? As Elijah pointed to the seat across from him, Dr. Holloway took a seat and sipped her coffee. For a moment they sat there, companionable quiet before she spoke. How are you really feeling? She asked. Elijah leaned back in his chair and slowly let out a breath. I really am still thinking about it. I thought that when the case was over it would be like a weight had been lifted. It's still there in some ways, but it's changed in some ways, Doctor, Holloway told her. Sign of understanding that what Miss Wallace put you through wasn't just a court case, was personal. It had to do with who you are and how much you're worth here, Elijah. Met her eyes and liked how she seemed to understand that. Yes, that was it. It wasn't just about me as a doctor. As a black man in charge, she couldn't handle that. Dr. Holloway told her to put down her coffee and calm down. Still, you proved that you belong here. You showed everyone that you're not just here because you're one of the best. You're here. The hospital knows it, the court knows it, and now Miss Wallace also knows it. Elijah gave a small smile, but his eyes stayed serious. I know, but it's hard not to, Wallace said. I always feel like I need to prove myself because no matter how hard I work, someone will always be better than me. Dr. Holloway reached across the table and gently put her hand on his shoulder. Elijah, you've proven, she said, many times, and yes, there will always be people like Miss Wallace who try to bring you down, but that doesn't take away from what you've done. You earned this spot, and she can't take it away from you. Elijah agreed with what she said. You don't have to do it alone, Dr. Holloway said softly. That's what I need to keep telling myself. The hospital stands behind you, and we always will. We're all here with you, Elijah smiled. Thank you very much, that means a lot. As the night went on, Elijah left the hospital and walked out into the cool evening. The city light stretched out in front of him like a map of the world that was always moving. No matter what fights were fought inside its walls, he always won this one. But he knew it wasn't the last one he'd have to face. He was no longer in the fight by himself. The road ahead would be hard, but for now he could take a deep breath. He had been through easier times and come out stronger and more adaptable. As he walked down the street, he thought that maybe Greg had been right. It wasn't about getting rid of the scars. It was about letting them shape who he became. Something stronger, and Elijah Matthews knew he was ready for anything that came next with each step.